If you had a chuck out of wood, would it be a woodchuck? Hello you dirty potters, how are you today? Today we're going to learn how to make one of my favorite types of chucks, and there's two primary chucks that I usually use when trimming my work that needs a chuck, and this one is a U-shaped chuck, but I like to call it the wormhole type. The second type I like to make is the A-frame, but today we're just going to concentrate on the wormhole type. Now in a previous episode I showed you guys how to use one of these, so today we're going to learn how to make one of these so that you can use it later on. Please keep in mind there's a bunch of different types of chucks. My favorite two are the U-shaped chuck or the wormhole chuck and the A-frame chuck, because those seem to be the ones that I use the most out of all my artwork. Usually an A-frame chuck is used for things with really sharp shoulders, and this U-shaped one, or the wormhole one, is used for ones that have really round shapes and really small tops. Usual Japanese traditional shapes. You know, with the big round type. But before we get started, there's a couple things you might need along the way to make this job a little bit easier. Number one, we are throwing this on a bat today, which means you're most likely going to need bat pins to hold this bat down to your wheel. If you haven't seen that episode, I will link it down below for you so you can know where to get them and if you need one. But if this is the last thing you're throwing for the day and you're just going to leave it on your wheel overnight and not take it off, then you can simply not use a bat. But I got crap to do, so we're using a bat today. Making a U-shaped chuck is actually extremely simple, but the one thing that you really need to concentrate on is that you need to go all the way down to the bottom of your wheel whenever you're making that little insertion and putting your fingers in to pull that hole or make that donut. Probably noticed by now that a chuck not only is open on the top, but it's also open on the bottom. You have to be able to push all the way down to the wheel head so you can make this nice big hole here. Just stick your hand all up in there. So first, let's center our clay. Now once you have this centered, you're going to have to open up. The only difference is, usually when you open up, you would stop somewhere about right here to leave space because you don't want to go all the way through your clay body and touch that wheel bottom. But this time, you're going to go all the way down to your wheel head. I know it's really difficult for some beginners because you've been trained not to do that your entire potter life, but this is one of the few times where it's okay. Now once you've got it all the way opened up and you've touched the wheel head or the bat, the next part is a little bit tricky. Your job now is to get your fingers all the way at the bottom of this and crunkle your fingers just like this. Just like you were pulling a normal cylinder, the only difference is this time you're touching the actual wheel head or the bat at the very bottom. And this is a very normal thing for people who are trying to make a pot in the first place. The only difference is it's going to feel a little bit strange because you're touching the very bottom of your wheel head. The part you really have to remember here is that if you're not feeling the bottom of your wheel head or your bat at the very tallest part of your hand or your fingers, you're not doing it correctly. That most likely means that you're pulling part of the clay that is not the very bottom of the cylinder right here. So be extremely careful and mindful of what your hand is actually touching. Potter tip! If you're doing this and you're pulling out here, you're going to end up pulling the entire cylinder outwards. It's perfectly fine to rest your hand right here and just go ahead and crunkle your fingers inwards. You'll get a nice little donut, but you can very well even that out later. But it's better than stretching the entire cylinder outwards, so just be very conscious of where your hand is resting while you do this. And look at that now, we have all that space down there. This is about how big I want my chuck. And please remember, the perimeter or the outside edges of your circle are going to be the outer edges of your chuck. So if you wanted your chuck to be this big, you would have had to make it much larger at its base when you centered it. But for this one, we're just doing a very medium-sized chuck. So if you ever wanted a bigger chuck, you can very well just center way out here and do the same exact process. Now that the hard part's out of the way, it's time for the harder part. Now it's time to even out your clay or pull your cylinder. Okay, now that we're done with the first pull, our cylinder should look something similar to this. This is a very straight and narrow cylinder though. We don't want this. We want that nice, curvy, sexy shape right here. But we are now about 3/4 of the way done. Now all we have to do is put some water on the outside and make sure this space here is completely curved inwards like a nice little wormhole. Now there's two different ways you can do this, and it really depends on what you want for a chuck and what you want as a potter for workability later on. Number one, you could choke this in and you would leave the top and bottom cylinder relatively the same aside from trimming. Or number 2, you could just make this curve come inwards right here and leave this right here. This would be essentially the same exact size, it would just be a little curvy, and you can pull this side out and trim this side a little bit to make an extra large side on this side and on this side. And I know that might have been a little bit confusing, but let's try to explain it this way. So if I wanted to make my chuck bigger, I would just leave this like this and pull this out to a very large open mouth, just like this. And I would keep doing this so that I can put larger and larger pieces inside here at a later time. This is a very standard chuck, but this is usually used for extremely large pieces. But you could very well fit something very, very large and curvy in here if you wanted to. So you can either pull this mouth open and leave this the same size, which would leave room for a normal sized piece and a very large round shaped piece. Or your other option is you can choke in this entire body right here, and you can make it way taller, but this mouth up here is going to be a lot smaller. Now this is really beneficial in case you have really long bottleneck pieces. You now have way more space to fit that long bottleneck piece into the cylinder right here. But if you had something like a Korean moon vase, you don't really need this. Korean moon vases don't usually come with these very long necks. So you would really just need this round part. So you're really choosing in between something that would have a bottleneck or a very large body, and those are your two options. I think today we're going to be going for the very large body one because I have tons of bottleneck ones that I could use anytime. Potter tip! The only two things that really matter are the top portion and the bottom portion of your chuck. As far as this middle portion goes, as long as the top and bottom measure up, you should be fine. But just in case you want a nice straight curvy bottom is nice and sexy, you can always take your metal rib, flip it over, and push the wall against the outer curve of your metal rib. And this will not only get rid of a lot of the lines, but it'll also get rid of most textures on the outside of your clay body. See, and there you go. The only thing left is this sexy Amber Rose-esque curve here. Don't judge me, I know what I like. Just like when you're throwing a plate, it is an extremely good idea to take your cutting tool and make a pre-cut before it even starts to dry. This will make sure when it's ready to come off, it comes off nice and easy, and you won't have to struggle with it later on. Trust me, you're gonna do this one time and forget to cut and be like, oh man, I should have cut. And if you used a bat, you can very easily just take it off without worrying about messing it up now.
Eventually.
After you've let this dry for a couple days, it should be extremely easy to take off, especially because we made that pre-cut from before. So now it's time to trim that bottom. You see, when you're making this chuck, it's not too difficult to go ahead and put a little sponge or a little towel over this and make sure it's nice and smooth. But when you were throwing it, you really didn't have access to do that same exact thing to the bottom, so now you're gonna have to turn it over and trim it. Trimming the bottom is actually an extremely important step, because if you don't trim the bottom, you essentially have these jagged edges which can mess up your piece if you ever try to put it on this other side. And if you never use the other side, well, you're pretty much just cutting the versatility of your chuck in half. You essentially only made it for this side right here. And that's just a waste of clay and a waste of a tool. So you really want to be able to have access and be able to use this smaller side, especially if you ever have a smaller piece. And we definitely don't want to put our leather soft piece here, take it off, and have it gouge into our piece with all these hard edges after we biscuit. So we're definitely going to smooth these down. Potter tip! The outside really doesn't matter. You can just take a sponge over this. But your piece is actually never going to be touching the outside. All this is going to be made for is battening it down later on when you decide to trim. You really only need to pay attention to the inside and how smooth the inside is going to be. It needs to be completely smooth and rounded. You can do that by taking your trim tool and just pushing very lightly against this wall right here, and slowly it will become a nice outward curvature. Then you go ahead and even out the top, and you should be good. After you even out the top, go ahead and make sure you take your wet sponge or whatever you have and round out this sharp edge right here. The entire reason we're trimming the bottom is to make sure that it doesn't hurt our piece later on whenever we decide to use this as an actual chuck after the bisque phase. So you want to make sure that this is nice and smooth and rounded so any piece you put on here doesn't get damaged. And there you go, you have just made your first chuck. Congratulations! You can make pieces that look like giant boobs now. You know, it's a big round shape, but it's all closed off at the top, with a little tiny nipple right there. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I really hope this helps some of you guys learn how to make your own chucks, and to make different sizes so that they can go to your artistic style. Remember, there are a bunch of different types of chucks. This one right here is the U-shaped chuck, or I like to call it the wormhole chuck, But there's also a bunch of different chucks made for pointy pieces, made for rounded pieces, and made for straight pieces, those being just tall cylinders. And the key component you have to remember is you're basically making a flared out cylinder, but you're really just making sure you put a hole at the bottom. That's basically all a chuck really is. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. I really hope that this helps you guys work on some of your own artwork at home. If you'd like to see any of my artwork, the links are always down below for your beautiful Potter eyes, and I will see you Dirty Potters next week. This looks like one of those cones you put on like dogs' heads to make sure that they don't, you know?